This is the Book of Mormon Digging Deeper. I'm your host, Mark Swint. So glad to have you here with us today. It's a simple request, really. Abstain from coffee, tea, alcohol, and tobacco. And it comes with a wonderful promise for those who do. But my, oh my, what a challenge it is for many people. And for all of the things that Latter-day Saints teach and believe in and are known for, this one practice is the thing that everybody seems to focus on when they meet us. And it seems to take on a life of its own. Since coffee contains caffeine and many cola products have caffeine in them, friends are quick to point out that we can't have Coca-Cola either if we can't drink coffee. Of course, this is after they've asked us how many wives we have. But I already did an episode on polygamy, so let's take a look at the word of wisdom today and find out all the things we can't do, shall we? I just love it when people try to tell me what I believe and what I can and can't do in my religion. After all, many churches preach prohibitions on all kinds of things, and yet their members are never held up to scrutiny over those things. But not drinking and not smoking, or even having a cup of coffee in the morning is, I guess, a more visible and socially puzzling position to take. So I can see their curiosity. I don't really take offense when someone asks me or tells me about these things. I see it as a way to introduce them to some of our doctrines and practices and explain them in a coherent way. Still, I think the issue that most people have with it is that my church asks me to keep this principle rather than it just being my own personal decision. After all, very many people have given up or never even started smoking these days, and no one challenges them on that. Very many people have given up alcohol, and they are congratulated for that. We praise their sobriety and the number of months or years they have been sober. Yet when our church gives us guidance that these things are not good for humans, we are somehow chided about that. Isn't that odd? The doctrinal basis for our Word of Wisdom practices is found in the 89th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. So no, it is not biblical, and yes, Jesus drank wine, and no, it was not just the pure fruit of the vine, unfermented and non-alcoholic. Over the years, I have heard so many apologists try to explain away wine in the Bible as pure unfermented grape juice. I appreciate their efforts, but we do not need to justify our practices on what occurred in biblical times, nor do we need to apologize for them. You see, Earth's history of mankind has been marked by dispensations, periods of time in which certain laws were in place between man and God. Adam and his people lived under a set of laws and rules that existed until almost the flood, at which time the waters receded. Noah was given a modified set of laws in the Noahite dispensation, if we can call it that. And after him, we come to the time of Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant. Again, a new set of laws. This was followed by Moses and the Mosaic Law, and in this case it was actually called the Law of Moses. And this dispensation lasted until the time of the Savior, which time became the dispensation of the meridian of time. The Savior came specifically to fulfill the law of Moses and offer his new paradigm. In fact, it was his declaration that he came to fulfill the law of Moses that caused the final uproar that led to his crucifixion. He clearly had said that this was part of his mission. In Matthew 5, we read, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." This was during his Sermon on the Mount, where he introduced a higher law. We might call it the law of Christ, but it was basically just a portion of the higher law of heaven and of the kingdom of God. In 1820, actions were set in motion that began to usher in the restoration of this gospel of Jesus Christ and the dispensation of the fullness of times. This did not happen all at once, but took a number of years, and in fact, it could be argued that the restoration continues to this day. Nevertheless, with the restoration of the sealing powers conferred by Elijah upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery in 1836, we had the fundamental elements of the new and everlasting covenant of the priesthood. We are now in the dispensation of the fullness of times. Now you may ask, what does this have to do with the word of wisdom? Well, I'll tell you. Years ago, I undertook a study of biblical law. I determined to write a book justifying how the scriptures could claim that God was the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, when the Old Testament seemed so harsh and unforgiving, while the New Testament seemed just the opposite. It was a fascinating project, and when I was done, I had a manuscript of over 500 pages. It was called Law of Moses, Law of Christ. I actually submitted it for publication, but the publishers decided that it was too long and no one would buy a 500-plus page church book. No matter, I didn't do it for money or for fame. I did it for myself, and it was a truly powerful and wonderful experience for me. But one of the most interesting things I learned was that every dispensation had a unique code or guidance about food, what could be eaten and what could not, and that changed with each dispensation. To Adam, God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the earth, and every tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat. And to every beast of the field I have given every green herb for meat." Now, I should note that the archaic term for meat, or the biblical term, if you will, referred to food, to sustenance, not animal flesh. It appears that in the dispensation of Adam, the diet prescribed by God was vegetarian for both humans and animals. So then along comes the flood, and in Genesis 9, after the flood and the ushering in of a new dispensation, the dispensation of Noah, we read, "Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things." Here, God grants Noah and his descendants permission to eat, quote, "every moving thing that liveth," which included fish, as well as land animals and birds. During the time of Moses and the children of Israel wandering in the desert, this was a severe time of limitations on the food and what they could find to eat, but it was also a time of severe limitations and practices. The books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy told the Israelites exactly what they could eat, how it was to be prepared, and how it was to be handled. First and foremost, food was divided into clean and unclean. This was a concept never before mentioned since the days of Adam. For example, land animals. The people of Moses were permitted to eat only those land animals that had a split hoof and that chewed the cud. Cattle, sheep, and goats met this criteria, while camels and pigs did not. Pigs had the split hoof but did not chew the cud, while camels chewed the cud but did not have the split hoof. And by the way, chewing the cud means to chew the food that returns from the stomach for further processing. I know, sounds awful. With respect to seafood, the Israelites could only eat fish with fins and scales, while other such delicacies as lobster and shrimp and shellfish, as well as catfish, sharks, which I've had, which is very good, and eels were prohibited. Insects such as locusts, crickets, and grasshoppers were permitted. All animals that were used for food had to be properly drained of blood, and no animal that died naturally was to be eaten at all. One other dietary prohibition was that meat and dairy could not be cooked or mixed together. I guess that would even include sautéing meat in some nice butter. In addition to these rules, there were laws governing the handling of food for sacrificial rites and festival meals. During Passover, for example, only unleavened bread could be consumed, and meat from peace offerings had to be eaten within 2 days. Now, the list of food laws goes on, but this gives you an idea of the food laws of that dispensation. So as we move into the dispensation of the meridian of time, when Jesus Christ walked the earth, he took a much more pragmatic approach to food. And it was part of a larger effort to change the people's thinking from a literalist approach to a realistic one. He taught in Mark that what enters a person's mouth does not make them unclean, but rather what comes out of their heart. He said, "There is nothing from without a man that entering him can defile him, but the things which come out of him, those are they that defile a man." And he said unto them, "Are ye so without understanding also? Do ye not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth the man, it cannot defile him, because it entereth not into his heart, but into the belly, and goeth out into the draught, purging all meats?" And he said, "That which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man." He was teaching, of course, that the nature of man, being clean or unclean, was not a matter of what food he ate, but what thoughts and actions his heart led him to take. And this position on food was further clarified by Peter in the 10th chapter of Acts, where we read, "Peter went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, and he became very hungry, and would have eaten, but while they made ready, he fell into a trance. And he saw heaven opened, and a certain vessel descending unto him, as it had been a great sheet knit at the four corners, and let down to earth, wherein were all kinds of four-footed beasts of the earth, and wild beasts, and creeping things, and fowls of the air. And there came a voice to him, saying, Rise, Peter, kill and eat. But Peter said, Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is common or unclean. And the voice spake unto him again the second time, What God hath cleansed, that call not thou common. And later in Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas meet with the brethren. The issue at hand is how to integrate the Gentiles whom the Lord had sent them to preach to and bring them into the fold. The discussion involved how much of the Mosaic practices they should be made to follow, and the main point had to do with circumcision. Should they be made to be circumcised to be part of the community of followers? Verse 1 asks this very question. It says, And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. Well, it was a contentious point, as you might imagine, and Paul and Barnabas disagreed strongly. They agreed to go to Jerusalem and consult with the other apostles and elders, and verse 5 tells us, But there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, and this would be Pharisees who were converted to Christianity, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. So the apostles and elders came together to consider all of this. See, they believed in Jesus, but still clung to the old ways, and the law of Moses was so ingrained that they had difficulty letting go. So the apostles and the elders came together to consider this. A spirited discussion ensued, but let me see if I can summarize adequately the outcome of their meeting. Paul rose up and declared, Men and brethren, ye know how that a good while ago God made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, which knoweth the hearts, bear witness, giving them the Holy Ghost, even as he did unto us, and put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Now, therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the necks of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear. Wherefore, my sentence is, that we trouble them not, which from the Gentiles are turned to God. But that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. In other words, Peter was saying there was no reason to saddle the Gentiles with the law of Moses, other than for a few exceptions. And again, we can clearly see a break from the law of Moses as the dispensation of the gospel of Jesus Christ was ushered in. This dispensation, I guess I should call it the dispensation of the meridian of time, has existed since that time until the Restoration in the 1820s. And we're not erasing the dispensation of the meridian of time at all. We're filling it out. We're moving from that dispensation to the dispensation of the fullness of times, the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I can refer you back to an episode I did just a few weeks ago on the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, what's different, you ask? The temples and the priesthood and the new and everlasting covenant of Christ. In this new dispensation, we are pretty well set with the dietary laws from the time of Christ. However, one important revelation was received with the Restoration, and it is the subject of our visit today. It is the 89th section of the Doctrine and Covenants. It is called the Word of Wisdom, and with good reason, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But first, let me give you just a bit of history. Like many of the other revelations in the early church, Doctrine and Covenants 89 came to us in response to a problem. As many of the men were called to be missionaries and sent out into the world, they needed to be taught and prepared for the task. That preparation took place on the second floor of the Newell K. Whitney store in Kirtland, Ohio. You've heard me speak of Newell K. Whitney before. He and his wife Elizabeth Ann were very devout Christians in Kirtland when Joseph Smith and his wife arrived there in 1831. The Whitneys took the Smiths into their home and gave them refuge as the work began, and were among the first converts. Doctrine and Covenants, section 72, calls Whitney a bishop, and indeed he was called as the first bishop of Kirtland. His very prosperous store became the bishop's storehouse, and as bishop, he oversaw the care of the poor and the needy, and he managed the church donations and supported the temporal operations of the church. Well, Joseph needed a place to prepare these new missionaries, and Newell made the second floor of his store the site of the School of the Prophets. Now, if we turn to the Church Topics and Study Guide, we get an account of the routine and activities of these men. It says, every morning after breakfast, the men met in the school to hear instruction from Joseph Smith. The room was very small, and about 25 elders packed the space. The first thing they did after sitting down was light a pipe and begin to talk about the great things of the kingdom and puff away. Brigham Young recounted the following. The clouds of smoke were so thick the men could hardly even see Joseph through the haze. And once the pipes were smoked out, they would then put in a chew on one side and perhaps on both sides, and then it was all over the floor. In this dingy setting, Joseph Smith attempted to teach the men how they and their converts could become holy, without spot, and worthy of the presence of God. Now, our detractors like to tell how Emma Smith hated the smoking and the spitting above the Whitney store, especially as she and the other women had to clean the place frequently. They say that she complained to Joseph Smith, and he supposedly said, "You want a revelation? I'll give you a revelation," and went off only to come back a short time later with the word of wisdom. They used that story to indicate that Joseph made up revelations as they were needed or convenient, and in this case, to placate an angry wife. Well, that's just not true. But it was Emma who prompted Joseph to ask the Lord about it. And that's okay. Every revelation was received as an answer to a question Joseph took to the Lord. And the source or motivation for that question was really unimportant. In this case, it was Emma who raised the question. And out of respect for her, Joseph did indeed go off to seek the Lord's input on the matter. Brigham Young recalled that, quote, she could not make the floor look decent. The stains were impossible to get out. Emma felt, wisely, that the whole situation seemed less than ideal for those who were called of God, as these elders were, especially when we remember that the room with the filthy floor was Joseph's translation room, the same place where he received revelations in the name of God. So yes, it was Emma's complaining, if you will, that moved Joseph to inquire of the Lord. But it was not done grudgingly. Joseph began by pondering what could be done, and finally, on February 27th of 1832, just a month after the School of the Prophets was organized, he received the revelation now known as Section 89, the Word of Wisdom. Within that revelation came these strong words: tobacco is not for man, but is for bruises and all sick cattle, to be used with judgment and care. My dear sweet grandfather was not a member of the church. He was a rancher and a farmer all his life, but I remember him telling us how they used tobacco for their sick cattle. I don't know how he used it, but obviously it was a common practice of the day. Now, this revelation in section 89 addressed more than just tobacco, however. Joseph had gone to the Lord to seek an answer to Emma's question about smoking and tobacco, and he received the definitive answer quickly. But the Lord was not done. He had much more to teach. He begins his response to Joseph's query this way. He says, a word of wisdom for the benefit of the council of high priests assembled in Kirtland and the church, and also the saints in Zion. Well, right off the bat, this is different than any of the other revelations Joseph would receive. Normally, the Lord would have said something like, a commandment I give unto you. But nowhere else have we heard him say or give a word of wisdom. The next verse is also unique. It's not a commandment nor a directive. He says, to be sent by greeting, not by commandment or constraint, but by revelation and the word of wisdom, showing forth the order and will of God in the temporal salvation of all saints in the last days. Now, how interesting. The Lord reveals his will, to be sure, but he makes it perfectly clear that it is not a commandment. And he speaks not of eternal salvation, but of temporal salvation. Just to be clear, he is speaking of our physical survival in this mortal realm rather than in heaven, the survival of our bodies. I think these first two verses are intriguing and unique among all the Scripture. The Lord sounds as though he's sitting down with us and just talking about life, and he happens to know more than we do, so he's sharing what he knows and giving us some advice as a friend would do. The next two verses explain why he was doing this. And remember, all Joseph had asked about was tobacco and smoking. But the Lord says, continuing with his previous thought, given for a principle with a promise, adapted to the capacity of the weak and the weakest of all saints who are or can be called saints. Behold, verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, in consequence of evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days, I have warned you and forewarned you by giving unto you this word of wisdom by revelation. Now, do you hear what he's saying here? He is not just saying that the things he's going to tell us are bad for us or should be abstained from. He is telling us much more. He's saying that there are and will be men who conspire to do us harm, who have evil in their hearts, and who lay out devious plans and designs to get us to do what they want. And what they all want is to make money. To that end, they will scheme and figure out ways to get us to give them more money than might otherwise be normal. And now you're asking, well, what do I mean by that? Listen, we all need things that we can't all produce ourselves: food, medicine, and other products. So we split the task up. Some of us learn to be cobblers and we make shoes for all the others. Some of us learn to be builders so we can erect homes for everyone else. Others of us learn to make clothing so that we don't all have to run around naked. And we sell the products of our trade so that we can each make a living doing something that is of service to other sectors in our economy. And that's okay. That is in keeping with the Lord's declaration to Adam and Eve that by the sweat of their brows they would eat bread all their days. But as the world moved from an almost totally agrarian society where almost everyone was a farmer and grew their own vegetables and raised their own cattle and sheep, to one where many of us live in cities and became more of a consumer society, we had need for others to keep producing food. We all have to eat, after all, and here again we traded our goods and services, or our money, for the food our farmers produced. And all of this was and still is okay. But the Lord's warning here in verse 4 of the 89th section is not talking about that. He specifically mentions the evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of conspiring men in the last days. So what's he talking about? Well, 4 weeks ago, I talked about conspiracies and secret combinations. And that was about the conspiracies involving governmental control and power over the people. But apparently, according to the 89th section, there are other types of conspiracies as well. And this section concerns the temporal well-being of all of us. I'd say the Lord is speaking to us about food and products that we take into our bodies. Now, of course, we all need to eat every single day, more or less. Sometimes we fast. And today we have a remarkable variety of foods from which to choose. We can have eggs and bacon for breakfast, or we can have pancakes, or cereal, or oatmeal, or we can just start the day with a protein shake and an energy bar. There is literally an endless menu to choose from. And we have not just grocery stores providing fresh produce and fruits, but supermarkets with literally thousands of options to choose from. So how do we choose? And if I make a particular food product, how do I get you to choose my product more often than someone else's? There's the great question, you see. The one most obvious answer is that I make the best tasting or most satisfying product from the list of competing products that vie for your attention. In a free market, this is a good thing because it drives competition and theoretically makes all products better. Poor products fail immediately and quickly disappear from the shelves. But the Lord warned us against the evils and designs of conspiring men in the last days. How does this fit in? Now, here I have to be careful not to delve into politics too deeply because it seems that this, like every other issue today, is politically sensitive. Nevertheless, the 89th section implies, or rather says directly, that in our day, evil and conspiring men will somehow affect the products we consume or use. So we have to be realistic and take a look, politics aside. When I was a kid in the 60s, we never heard of anyone having peanut allergies, at least not to any significant degree and nothing that I remember. I tried looking up statistics on that, and I found that there was no data from the 60s because it was such an extremely rare condition. In fact, here's what I found. Quote, before 1980, peanut allergies were considered exceptional and marginal, with no population level surveys tracking them separately from other rare food reactions. Estimates suggest rates were well below 0.1% in children, effectively negligible compared to today. By contrast, today that rate is between 2 and 3%. Now this is just since 1980, and that is at least a 30 to perhaps a 50-fold increase. And any prudent person must ask, how did that happen and why? Well, I think it has to do with several factors, including the additives that are put into our food and the ultra processing of our foods today. I'm sure many of you are aware of recent political statements and efforts to get many food additives out of our food, and I tend to agree with that effort greatly. Other countries have already made those steps, and in America it seems to be a free-for-all, but I believe that is changing. With respect to the opinions and feelings of those of you who feel differently, I will respect the opinions and feelings of those of you who feel differently, but I'm sure that many of you have traveled to other countries and eaten their food and noticed a difference. I spent a few weeks in Italy and Greece a while back and noticed right away that no matter how much I ate, I didn't feel bloated. I also enjoyed the food immensely and yet lost weight while I was over there. Now, I do not have any gluten sensitivity, but I have friends who do, and I am told by them that if they eat wheat from Italy or some other European sources, they do not have the same issues that they have here in America. And the rise of celiac disease, which is the disease that manifests itself through gluten-heavy foods, didn't even exist several decades ago. But almost all of our food here in America is highly processed food from great factories. That food is prepared with an almost countless array of preservatives, homogenizers, sweeteners, and additives for color and texture and taste. And the rise in food allergies and other deleterious conditions plaguing us today have risen in parallel with those processes and becoming the predominant method of food preparation. It seems that as we get away, though, from highly processed and refined foods, we get away from many of the intestinal and systemic issues that many of us are suffering from. So there must be a connection. Food dyes have been in the news lately, and recently a number of them have been banned. Some have been shown to be outright poisonous. A number are petroleum-based, as are other additives, which can only be surmised to be included in our food, again, to make it more attractive, more flavorful, and more addictive. And that is the key. Make a food addictive and it will sell more. And the company will capture a greater portion of the market. And that means more money. I acknowledge that companies are in the business to make money. I understand that. But if they have to conspire to make their food more than just nutritional, if they have to make it almost or genuinely addictive, then maybe they fall into that category the 89th section is talking about. Maybe they are the evil and conspiring men. Maybe these food-related problems are the results of the evils and designs which do and will exist in the hearts of these men. And speaking of additives, I did some research on tobacco. Did you know that tobacco in the average American cigarette has over 600 additives, which, when smoked, create over 7,000, that's right, 7,000 different chemical compounds? Why is that? When the Indians first showed Sir Walter Raleigh how they smoked tobacco, I guarantee you it did not have 600 additives in it. Obesity rates in the U.S. have risen sharply and with frightening rapidity. According to statistics from the CDC, obesity rates are now sitting at over 40%. That means everybody. At least in the United States, at least 40% of Americans are overweight. They're obese. Data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey provides measured, not estimates, numbers from 1960 to 1962, showing that then obesity rates were only 13%. So that's a threefold increase from the 1960s. How about diabetes? The rate of diabetes in America, both type 1 and type 2, has increased from under 3% to 10%. And for adults over 65, that rate is now 30%. And excluding those people, if you just look at the other people who don't have diabetes, those diagnosed as pre-diabetic are sitting at more than 1 in 3 of the rest of us. In other words, a third of us who aren't diabetic are pre-diabetic. I'm sure that there are many factors that lead to these numbers, but we must not be so blind as to think that the big companies that now provide us our food have only our best health and interest in mind. If they can find an additive or a preservative or a coloring or an additional flavoring or extra sugar that makes their food better and more sellable, they're going to do it and they're going to sell it. Their job is to sell food and sell as much of it as they can. Does it not make sense that they would do whatever they could to boost those sales? Perhaps with additives that make them more addictive as well. Or even by just adding a little more sugar or a little more fat or a little more salt. And wouldn't it make sense to, for example, take out more expensive ingredients and replace them with less expensive artificial ingredients to save more money and then sell those more expensive ingredients in some other application? Did you know that peanut oil, which makes up 40% of a peanut, is quite valuable? So much so that it makes sense for the manufacturers to take it out of peanuts when they're making peanut butter. And they replace it with less expensive oils that are fully hydrogenated, oils like cottonseed, soybean, or palm oils. Now, in fairness, one reason for this substitution is that partially hydrogenated peanut oil is liquid at room temperature and would separate in the jar on the shelf. The other fully hydrogenated oils maintain the texture, and I understand that. But still, what we get when we buy these highly processed foods is a cornucopia of ingredients, many of which are not as healthy for us as the original products. And some of these are downright poisonous. Another great problem in today's society is autism. Autism barely existed back in the 1960s, and yet today autism rates have skyrocketed. According to the CDC, in just the last 40 years, that's the mid-80s, that's not even going back to 1960, autism rates have increased dramatically since the mid-1980s, rising from, listen to this, a rarity to a common neurodevelopmental condition. Numbers provided by the CDC tell us that the rate has increased from 3 cases per 10,000 people in the 1980s to 33 cases per 10,000 people today. That's an 11-fold increase in the autism rate since my first child was born. Now, today there is an increased awareness of the food, medicines, and vaccines that we're exposed to, and change is beginning to happen. But it is not voluntary on the part of the food processors. They are being forced to do so because of an increased concern that the customer has. And I'm not trying to tie all of this to conspiracies, but then again, some of these facts are pretty compelling, and it is very hard to even find some of this data. The big companies do not want to divulge it. So getting back to the word of wisdom, and this word of warning that the Lord gave us. This is the first dispensation in which food was going to be delivered not by farmers at a farmer's market, straight from the fields, but from factories and processing plants, institutions with perhaps less altruistic intentions, or at least with some serious profit motives at their base. Scripturally, this is the first time that the Lord, in specifying what should and should not be eaten, actually had to warn us and call this a warning, a forewarning, a revelation, a word of wisdom. I hope that change isn't lost on you. But anyway, enough of my soapbox for the moment. The word of wisdom says other profound things. Right off it says, after talking about the things we've been discussing, it says, given for a principle with a promise. Now that's nice. That follows his statement that it was given not by commandment or constraint. The promise is found at the end of the revelation in verses 18 through 21. So let's skip to that now. There it says, all the saints who remember to keep and do these sayings, walking in obedience to the commandments, shall receive health in their navel and marrow in their bones, and shall find wisdom and great treasures of knowledge, even hidden treasures. And shall run and not be weary, and shall walk and not faint. And I, the Lord, give unto them a promise, that the destroying angel shall pass over them, as the children of Israel, and not slay them. That's quite a lovely promise. But about now you're saying to yourself, Mark, you've now said 3 times that the word of wisdom is not a commandment. But it sure sounds like a commandment. Why is that? Why am I asked if I live it every time I go in for a temple recommend? And then, of course, you probably get reminded by your friends every time you order a Coke or a Pepsi at the restaurant that you cannot have Coke or Pepsi. Like I said before, I just love it when people teach me what my church will and will not let me do. The word of wisdom was exactly what it claimed to be. It was taken at its word. It was not a commandment. It was counsel given to help keep us healthy and to perhaps avoid some of the dangers of modern day food. But it was a good principle, and the promise it made was, and still is, most precious to us. And the Lord said that it was revealing His will. And doesn't that kind of make it a commandment after all? It does in my book. FAIR.org is an organization dedicated to defending LDS doctrines and practices. They have a website full of very interesting research and answers to many nettlesome LDS questions. They speak extensively on the word of wisdom, and as for why it was not adopted right away as a standard practice, they say this. It required time to wind down practices that were so deeply ingrained in family tradition and culture, especially when fermented beverages of all kinds were frequently used for medicinal purposes. The term strong drink certainly included distilled spirits like whiskey, which afterwards the Latter-day Saints generally shunned. But it took a more moderate approach to milder alcoholic beverages like beer and pure wine of the grape of the vine of your own make. For the next 2 generations, Latter-day Saint leaders taught the word of wisdom as a command from God, but they tolerated a variety of viewpoints on how strictly the commandment should be observed. This incubation period gave the saints time to develop their own tradition of abstinence from habit-forming substances. By the early 20th century, when scientific medicines were more widely available, and also as temple attendance had become a more regular feature of Latter-day Saint worship, the church was ready to accept a more exacting standard of observance that would eliminate problems like alcoholism and addiction from among the obedient. In 1921, the Lord inspired Church President Heber J. Grant to call on all saints to live the word of wisdom to the letter by completely abstaining from all alcohol, coffee, tea, and tobacco. And today, church members are expected to live this higher standard. Let me step in here for a minute. The Lord did not command it, that is true. But church leaders are given stewardship over the workings of the church. Remember, we are not to be commanded nor compelled in all things, but are free to choose for ourselves. One of the great changes made to the relationship of man to the Lord in this new dispensation of the fullness of times was the shift of responsibility for the conduct of man from God to the individual. Instead of being directed in every single aspect of daily life, as were the Israelites, we are told to use our agency and to choose the right. If you'll notice, much of President Nelson's talks to us always were delivered with the gentlest of encouragement. You'll see that he shifted from directing us to encouraging us. He invited us to read the Book of Mormon. He encouraged us to lengthen our stride. This is the true evidence of righteous behavior instead of rote obedience to strict principles. There are consequences to our actions, to be sure, but when we choose the right, we're demonstrating righteousness rather than obedience. And that is what the Lord tried to get his disciples at the meridian of time to learn. This is why we are not expelled from the church for not paying our tithing or keeping the word of wisdom. You're not kicked out of the church for smoking. All are welcomed and encouraged to, as President Hinckley used to encourage us, do a little better. try a little harder, lengthen our strides. Our job is to make bad men good and good men better. The text of the Word of Wisdom forbids strong drink, which was initially interpreted as distilled beverages like hard liquor, whiskey, bourbon, gin. Beer, unfermented or lightly fermented wine, and cider were considered mild drinks, and therefore acceptable. Note that verse 17 specifically permits barley for mild drinks, and barley is a principal component in beer. The complete prohibition of alcoholic drinks of any kind only became part of the Word of Wisdom following the temperance movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. President Joseph F. Smith and Heber J. Grant both supported the temperance movement, which was giving up alcohol nationwide, and Grant made complete abstention from alcohol in any form a requirement for a temple recommend in the early 1920s. Now, let me interject another thought here. We're not talking about being expelled for lack of obedience here, but the temple's a different story. It is a sacred place and is intended for those who are on the path towards the celestial kingdom now. The things in the temple are sacred and should only be given to those who are doing as the Lord would have them do. When the 89th section said, adapted to the capacity of the weak and of the weakest of all saints, it was telling us that anyone on the celestial path could and should be able to follow this counsel. Accordingly, it became one of the requirements for demonstrating worthiness for a temple recommend. But this is a far cry from saying Mormons can't, whatever. Of course we can. We're agents unto ourselves and accountable for our own choices and actions. But if we want to go to the temple, we better be able to demonstrate to the Lord that we can keep a principle adapted to the capacity of the weakest of saints. Fair.org reminds us to consider that drinking water in Joseph Smith's day, or even back during biblical times, was a gamble at best because water purity was always questionable. A little alcohol in a beverage ensured that it was free of viruses and bacteria. The development of germ theory in the late 19th century led to chemical treatments to ensure a safe supply of public drinking water. A strict ban on all alcohol in Joseph Smith's time would have been a death sentence for many Latter-day Saints, especially during the 1832-1833 cholera pandemic, which was spread by water. The same sort of ramping up of requirements occurred with regard to tobacco, coffee, and tea. While use of these items was often discouraged by church leaders, enforcement was usually light and confined to people who were severe abusers. For example, Brigham Young made the following remarks in April 1870 General Conference. He said, "On Sunday, after meeting, going through the gallery which had been occupied by those claiming no doubt to be gentlemen and perhaps brethren, you might have supposed that cattle had been standing around there and dropping their nuisances. Here and there were great quids of tobacco, and places a foot or two square smeared with tobacco juice. I wish the doorkeepers, when in the future they observe any persons besmearing the seats and floor in this way, to request them to leave the house, and if they refuse and will not stop spitting about and besmearing their neighbors, just take them and lead them out carefully and kindly. We request all addicted to this practice to omit it while in this house. Elders of Israel, if you must chew tobacco, omit it while in meeting, and when you leave, you can take a double portion if you wish to." Earlier in 1861, Brigham had said, "Some of the brethren are very strenuous upon the word of wisdom, and would like to have me preach upon it, and urge it upon the brethren, and make it a test of fellowship. I do not think I shall do so. I have never done so." The early members struggled with the interpretation and living of the word of wisdom, and this was the result of several factors. One, they knew that it was given not by way of commandment, and two, it was a new thought and required people to change a physical behavior. And three, some exceptions by church leaders were seen by members in public. And four, other areas of church commandments had fallen short of true observance, such as the law of consecration. Occasional exceptions were noted to the total abstinence position. It was recorded, for example, that Joseph Smith drank from the fruit of the vine after a wedding feast in January of 1836. A week later, the First Presidency toasted with wine the marriage of John Boynton. This behavior was consistent with the prophet's view that the word of wisdom was intended to be a guideline inviting moderation and self-control versus excessive drunkenness and bad behavior. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, observance of the word of wisdom was not a condition of membership in the church. In the 1880s, though, John Taylor, as president of the church, started a reform movement to increase adherence to the word of wisdom by church leaders, which had considerable success. Now, between 1885 and 1893, the church was involved deeply with the polygamy question, and the emphasis on the word of wisdom naturally diminished by the church leaders. But by the time Joseph F. Smith became president in 1901, the word of wisdom was becoming an accepted and practical observance of church leaders and members. And President Smith refined the interpretation of hot drinks to be tea and coffee. He also started emphasizing not issuing temple recommends to flagrant violators. Leniency was still to be shown to older people with bad word of wisdom habits. At the October 1908 conference, the word of wisdom was a theme. Although this was a time when prohibition was a national issue, no direct reference is made to it in this conference. By 1917, prohibition did exist in Utah, and it remained until 1833, when Utahns voted for the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ending prohibition nationally. As President Heber J. Grant began his presidency, it had become the rule that compliance with the word of wisdom was a tenet of the faith of the membership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Before President Grant's death in 1945, the status of the revelation had risen to the level where it was binding, a test to the members' obedience, and a requirement for a temple recommend. As President Grant said in General Conference, "Today I appeal to you, each and all, to use your influence at home and abroad to get the people to keep the word of wisdom." So, since 1945 and during subsequent church presidencies, the word of wisdom has been accepted as a commandment of God, along with other commandments. Discussions now center over interpreting the provisions of the revelation to specific questions like the use of cola drinks, filtered cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, decaffeinated coffee, white bread, caffeine in chocolate bars, etc., things which didn't exist in the 1820s and the 1830s. To these inquiries, Bruce R. McConkie gave this response: "Some unstable people become cranks with reference to this law of health. It should be understood that the word of wisdom is not the gospel, and the gospel is not the word of wisdom." Now, I realize we've not talked about coffee and tea today, but I think the message I want to get out to you is not about specific elements of the 89th section, but rather the nature and concept of it and the manner in which it was presented to us. The Lord's message was that our bodies are the temples of our spirits, and as such should be kept as pure and holy as possible. It was impossible in 1832 to lay out all the things that would one day become threats to that purity and to our health. If given today, perhaps the word of wisdom would have specifically said to avoid heavily caffeinated beverages of any kind. Perhaps it would have also warned us against Twinkies and ding-dongs. It might have warned us against too much sugar or too much corn syrup at the very least. It almost certainly would have mentioned drugs like heroin and cocaine. And it also could have advised us to exercise regularly, something which most people in the 1800s got enough of naturally and didn't need to be encouraged to do. I guess what I'm saying is there are so many things that today seem to be making us sick. And if we needed to rely upon specifics laid out by the Lord, as the Jews did with the law of Moses, we would have received a much longer revelation. But the bottom line is, we have these amazing bodies that are capable of so much. It's our responsibility to take care of them. And to do that, we should use our own wisdom. We have the principle: take care of your bodies and be careful of what you put in them. And it is up to us to apply that principle in our lives as best as we can. Each of us has certain things that work for our bodies and other things that don't. Some can eat peanuts and other nuts, and some can't. Some can enjoy spicy foods, and others are up all night if they do. Some can eat wheat, and others cannot. Whatever your body tells you, listen to it. Do not let sickness and ill health cripple you if you can at all avoid it. Eat healthy, drink healthy, use vitamins and supplements as you need. Your body will thank you, and the Lord will be pleased with the stewardship you exercise over it. Brothers and sisters, I wish you good health and strong and vibrant bodies that will allow you to carry out your mission here on earth. I know that the Lord's promise, as found in this 89th section, applies to you. To echo President Hinckley, you're doing great. Just do a little more. Just reach a little more. Just lengthen your stride a little more. Do your best. I leave these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. I'm Mark Swint. Thank you so much for listening.